Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soothing. Something calm. Something wonderfully rigid and mildly unfair. So dim the lights, fluff the pillow, maybe let your phone gently slip toward your cheek, and let's drift back to a time when society was neatly arranged like a very serious wedding cake. At the top, the nobles. In the middle, the clergy. At the bottom, absolutely everyone else. And if you were born into one of those layers, well, congratulations. That was your personality now. No upgrades. No patch notes. Just vibes and taxes. The medieval class system was less of a suggestion and more of a life sentence. You were born. A priest muttered over you. And society quietly decided whether you would spend your days wearing velvet and complaining about peasants, or wearing wool and being complained about. There wasn't much wiggle room. Wiggle room was for people with land. Let's start gently at the top of our social pyramid. The nobles. Ah yes. The sparkly ones. The landowners. The people who believed that God personally approved of their cheekbones. In medieval Europe, particularly in places like France and England, nobility was built on land. Land was everything. If you owned land, you owned income. If you owned income, you owned armor. And if you owned armor, you owned authority. It was a very simple formula. Dirt equals power. At the very top of the nobles sat the king. Theoretically chosen by divine will. Practically chosen by birth order, survival, and occasional luck. A king like Louis XIV, though slightly later than our medieval peak, embodied the noble mindset beautifully. He famously declared, "I am the state." Which is a bold thing to say unless you are, in fact, the state. Medieval kings didn't always say it out loud, but they certainly felt it. If something went wrong, it was either God's mysterious plan or someone else's fault. Rarely theirs. Because why would it be? Nobles beneath the king included dukes, counts, barons, and various other titles that sound impressive but mostly meant owns a slightly smaller pile of land. These individuals swore loyalty to the king in elaborate ceremonies where everyone promised eternal devotion. Which lasted until someone offered more land. Feudal loyalty was strong. Until it wasn't. Now, let's imagine being born into this noble class. You would grow up in a cold stone castle. Which sounds romantic. Until you realize castles were drafty. They were damp. And privacy was more of a myth than a feature. Noble children were often raised by nurses and tutors rather than their parents. Emotional bonding was optional. Political alliances were not. Marriage for nobles was a strategic board game. Love was decorative. You married your cousin. Or your cousin's cousin. Or that duke's daughter who technically shared a great-grandmother with you, but it was fine because the Pope said so. Dynastic weirdness was not a side effect. It was the plan. Let's gently float to a famous example of what happens when nobles keep their bloodlines enthusiastically tight. The Habsburg dynasty, particularly in Spain and Austria, became legendary for keeping it all in the family. The result was Charles II of Spain, a king whose jaw became so famously prominent that historians still sigh about it. He struggled with health issues his entire life. But technically, he was very pure. Genetically speaking. Which, unfortunately, was the problem. But we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Back to the broader noble experience. Nobles were expected to fight. At least the men were. Knights trained from boyhood. They learned to ride horses, swing swords, and look dramatic while doing it. A young noble boy might be sent to another lord's household as a page, then a squire, slowly absorbing the art of warfare and etiquette. Which mostly meant learning how to stab politely. Women in the noble class had their own delicate responsibilities. They managed estates while husbands were off campaigning. They supervised servants. They produced heirs. Ideally healthy ones. And if they didn't produce heirs, well, history is full of awkward silences and replacement wives. Now let's drift slightly downward in our social pyramid to the clergy. The church was not just a spiritual institution. It was an economic powerhouse with excellent branding. In medieval Europe, particularly under the authority of the Catholic Church, the clergy occupied a unique space. They were technically separate from the nobles. But in practice, many bishops and abbots came from noble families. Because of course they did. If you had 3 sons, you might make one a knight, one a priest, and one a spare. High-ranking clergy lived quite comfortably. Bishops controlled vast lands. Monasteries accumulated wealth. The church collected tithes, which meant everyone, including peasants, contributed a portion of their earnings. 10% for God. A very tidy arrangement. And yet, the clergy were supposed to embody humility. Which they did. Sometimes. But medieval records are sprinkled with priests who enjoyed good wine, comfortable robes, and occasionally suspiciously luxurious lifestyles. The vow of poverty was interpreted with creative flexibility. Still, the church offered something powerful: education. Monasteries preserved texts. Clergy members were among the few who could read and write fluently. In a world where literacy was rare, this gave them immense influence. They recorded births, deaths, marriages. They advised kings. They shaped moral law. They told everyone that their place in the social pyramid was divinely ordained. Which was very convenient for the pyramid. And then, at the base of it all, we have the commoners. The peasants. The artisans. The merchants. The overwhelming majority of humanity just trying to exist without being taxed into dust. Peasants worked the land owned by nobles. In exchange, they received protection. Theoretically, a serf was legally tied to the land. They couldn't simply wake up and decide to move to a new village because they felt like a change of scenery. Their lives were defined by agricultural cycles. Plant. Harvest. Pay dues. Repeat. Homes were modest. Food was simple. Bread, pottage, maybe some vegetables. Meat if you were lucky. Or festive. Most peasants never traveled far beyond their village. The world was small. And shaped by local lords and parish priests. Yet even within the commoners, there were layers. Skilled craftsmen in growing towns began to form guilds. Merchants, especially in places like Venice, accumulated impressive wealth. Sometimes enough to rival minor nobles. Which made the nobles nervous. Because money was supposed to come from land. Not trade. Trade was suspiciously modern. Over time, these merchant classes would slowly erode the rigid medieval pyramid. But for centuries, the structure held firm. Nobles ruled. Clergy guided. Commoners labored. And what's fascinating is how deeply people internalized this hierarchy. It wasn't just economic. It was cosmic. The great chain of being placed God at the top, then angels, then kings, then nobles, and all the way down to peasants and animals. Everyone had a place. To question it was to question the universe itself, which felt ambitious. So as you settle further into your pillow, imagine this pyramid stretching across Europe. Stone castles rising above fields. Church bells echoing over villages. Peasants bending over crops while nobles debate lineage and clergy debate theology. It was orderly. In its own rigid way. Predictable. Mostly. And tomorrow night, perhaps, we'll gently wander into how this system began to crack. Because nothing human stays perfectly balanced forever. But for now, just let the pyramid stand. Solid. Heavy. Slightly unfair. And wonderfully sleepy. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft. Not a battle. Not a rebellion. Not even a dramatic royal meltdown. Just clothing. Rules about clothing. Very strict rules about clothing. So dim the lights, settle into your pillow, maybe let the day slowly drain out of your shoulders, and imagine yourself in a medieval town square. The air is cool. The bells are distant. And somewhere nearby, a local official is staring very hard at someone's sleeves to make sure they are not illegally fabulous. Because tonight, we're drifting into the quiet, slightly petty world of medieval clothing laws, manners, and public behavior. A time when what you wore could be illegal. When your shoelaces could be morally suspicious. And when chewing too loudly at dinner might quietly ruin your family's social standing for 3 generations. In medieval and early modern Europe, especially in places like England, France, and the ever-stylish city-states of Italy, clothing was not just about warmth or vanity. It was a billboard. It screamed your class, your wealth, your obedience to hierarchy. Or your dangerous ambition. These laws were called sumptuary laws. Which sounds elegant. Almost romantic. But they were essentially medieval dress codes with legal consequences. The idea was simple. If you were a peasant, you should look like a peasant. If you were a noble, you could sparkle. And if you were somewhere in between, well, you needed to know your place. Let's begin gently at the top. The nobles. Nobility loved fabric. They adored it. Silk, velvet, ermine, fur. Layers of it. The more impractical, the better. Sleeves so long they required management. Hats so elaborate they practically had their own personality. Colors were important too. Deep reds, rich blues, purples. Dyes were expensive, so wearing bright color was like saying, "Yes, I have money. Thank you for noticing." In fact, in many places, only the highest ranks were legally allowed to wear certain fabrics or colors. Purple, for instance, was famously associated with royalty, dating back to ancient times. If you were not royal and decided to casually wear purple because it matched your eyes, you might find yourself fined. Or publicly embarrassed. Which in medieval society was almost worse. Now imagine being a wealthy merchant. You've worked hard. You've built a business. You have coin. Real coin. And naturally, you want to look like success. So you buy a velvet coat. Maybe a gold chain. Something tasteful. Something subtle. And then a local official gently reminds you that velvet is for nobles. You, sir, may enjoy wool. High-quality wool, perhaps. But wool nonetheless. Because heaven forbid the social pyramid become visually confusing. Let's float over to one particularly fashion-conscious monarch, Edward III. In 14th century England, he issued detailed sumptuary laws specifying exactly who could wear what. Knights with land worth a certain amount could wear specific fabrics. Lesser knights could not. Merchants had limits. Servants had stricter ones. It was like a medieval spreadsheet of acceptable glamour. And this wasn't just about envy. It was about control. Clothing reinforced hierarchy. If you could see someone's rank immediately, you knew how to behave. Who to bow to. Who to ignore. Who might legally tax you. Of course, people bent the rules. Because humans have always bent rules. Tailors became creative. Merchants found subtle loopholes. And nobles themselves sometimes ignored restrictions when it suited them. Because if you are powerful enough, the law becomes more of a suggestion. Now let's gently lower our gaze to footwear. Ah yes. The famously dramatic medieval shoes. In the 14th and 15th centuries, especially in parts of Europe like France and England, fashionable men wore polanes. These were shoes with extremely long, pointed toes. Sometimes so long they had to be tied to the knee to prevent tripping. Which feels like a design flaw. But fashion rarely consults practicality. Naturally, sumptuary laws stepped in again. The length of your shoe's point could legally correspond to your social rank. A noble might have a longer, more dramatic point. A commoner, a modest little triangle. Imagine being arrested for excessive toe. But clothing wasn't the only battlefield of behavior. Manners were equally regulated. Because once you've controlled what people wear, the next logical step is controlling how they chew. Medieval table manners were surprisingly detailed. Manuals circulated explaining proper conduct. Don't wipe your nose on the tablecloth. Don't spit across the table. Don't grab food like a raccoon in a bread basket. These instructions were necessary. Which tells us a lot. One famous guide came from Erasmus, slightly later in the Renaissance, who wrote about civility and behavior in works aimed at educating young nobles. He gently advised children not to blow on their food too aggressively. Not to scratch themselves at dinner. Solid advice. Timeless, really. At noble courts, manners became a kind of performance art. Especially under rulers like Louis XIV, who turned daily rituals into elaborate theater at Versailles. The way you stood. The way you bowed. The way you handed the king his shirt. All choreographed. All political. Versailles was less a palace and more a stage. Nobles competed for proximity. Even watching the king wake up became an honor. Which is impressive dedication to hierarchy. Imagine fighting for the privilege of observing someone else brush their hair. And yet, these rituals worked. They distracted nobles from plotting rebellion. Hard to stage a coup when you're busy practicing the correct angle of your bow. Now, let's drift back down to the common people. Peasants did not have elaborate wardrobe concerns. Their clothing was practical. Wool tunics. Simple dresses. Aprons. Layers for warmth. The colors were muted because dye was expensive. Brown. Gray. Beige. The aesthetic was earthy realism. But even peasants had behavioral expectations. Public behavior mattered. Church attendance was mandatory in many areas. Religious festivals structured the calendar. Swearing too loudly or behaving indecently could land you before a local court. Medieval towns, especially in growing urban centers like Florence, began developing stricter civic codes. Gambling was monitored. Public drunkenness frowned upon. Certain celebrations were regulated. Authorities worried that too much fun might destabilize order. And underlying all of this was anxiety. Anxiety about class mobility. Anxiety about moral decay. Anxiety that someone might look richer than they were. Or behave above their station. Clothing laws also targeted women heavily. Because of course they did. Women's headdresses, sleeve lengths, jewelry, even the cut of gowns were regulated. Authorities often framed these laws as moral protection. In reality, they were about visibility and control. If a merchant's wife dressed too finely, she might be accused of vanity. Or worse, of pretending to noble status. Which was socially dangerous. The pyramid must remain visually obvious. And yet, fashion continued to evolve. Despite restrictions. Despite fines. People always find ways to express themselves. A slightly richer dye. A slightly sharper shoe. A slightly more dramatic hat. Let's gently pause in a candlelit medieval hall. Nobles in velvet. Clergy in somber robes. Merchants in carefully measured fabrics. Peasants in sturdy wool. Everyone aware of everyone else's place. It was orderly. It was performative. It was mildly exhausting. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson of medieval clothing and manners. Society wasn't just structured by land or law. It was stitched together by fabric. Reinforced by etiquette. Maintained by shared performance. So as you settle deeper into sleep, imagine the soft rustle of velvet. The scratch of wool. The distant echo of church bells reminding everyone to behave appropriately. Because in medieval Europe, even your shoelaces had a social rank. And tomorrow night, we might float into another gentle corner of history. Perhaps a royal wardrobe disaster. Or a scandal involving lace. But for now, just rest in the quiet certainty that at least your pajamas are legally permitted. And no one is measuring your sleeves. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft and slow. No battlefield clanging. No dramatic courtroom gasps. Just the quiet, heavy weight of reputation. So dim the lights. Let your shoulders drop. Maybe imagine a candle flickering somewhere in a drafty stone hallway. Tonight, we're drifting into the delicate medieval ecosystem of honor, shame, and the never-ending anxiety of what other people might be whispering about you behind a tapestry. Because in medieval Europe, reputation was not a side detail. It was the entire personality. Honor was currency. Shame was social death. And neither required the internet. Let's begin with the nobility. Of course we will. They were very invested in their image. A noble's honor was tied to lineage, land, and the vague but powerful concept of face. Not the literal face. Though that mattered too. Especially if you were part of a dynasty that had perhaps married cousins a little too enthusiastically. Honor for a nobleman meant bravery, loyalty, strength, public dignity. Even if privately he was a nervous wreck who couldn't balance his estate accounts. The appearance of confidence mattered more than the reality. If someone insulted your honor, you were expected to respond. Sometimes with a duel. Sometimes with legal action. Sometimes with a very stern letter written in elaborate handwriting. Take Henry II of England. He was intelligent, energetic, and had a talent for administration. He also had a slightly chaotic personal life. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine was powerful, dramatic, and quietly combustible. Eleanor was brilliant, independent, used to ruling vast lands in her own right. Henry was not particularly fond of being challenged. Their conflicts were not just marital disagreements. They were matters of royal honor, public perception, dynastic stability. When their sons eventually rebelled against Henry, it wasn't just political. It was humiliating. A king whose own children questioned him. That stung. Not only as a father, but as a monarch whose entire authority depended on the image of control. Honor was fragile like that. It could crumble quietly, without a sword being drawn. Let's float gently over to France. Specifically to Philip IV of France. Known as Philip the Fair. Which is ironic. Because fair referred to his appearance. Pale. Handsome. Regal. His personality, however, was less luminous. Philip was deeply concerned with royal authority and image. When his daughters-in-law were accused of scandalous behavior, the affair became a public crisis. Not merely because of the alleged misconduct, but because it threatened the honor of the Capetian dynasty. Reputation was collective. If one royal behaved badly, the entire family felt the stain. This is the exhausting part of hereditary prestige. You don't just inherit land. You inherit expectations. And you inherit the consequences of your relatives' decisions. Now let's gently descend into the concept of chivalry. Ah, chivalry. The medieval branding campaign for noble masculinity. Knights were supposed to be brave, loyal, pious, and respectful toward women. In theory. In practice, knights were human. Which complicated things. Chivalric codes were aspirational. They gave nobles a script. A way to perform honor publicly. Tournaments weren't just sport. They were theater. Armor polished. Banners flying. Spectators watching closely. Winning brought prestige. Losing could bruise more than pride. Honor culture also meant dueling became a socially acceptable method of conflict resolution in later centuries. If someone insulted you, you couldn't simply ignore it. Ignoring it suggested weakness. And weakness could ripple outward, affecting alliances and marriage prospects. Now, let's talk about shame. Because shame was the shadow of honor. It lingered. It waited. For women, especially noble women, reputation was razor thin. A rumor could shift a life. Allegations of infidelity, impropriety, or even flirtation could permanently damage standing. This was not equal territory. Men's indiscretions were often overlooked. Women's were catalogued. Consider Anne Boleyn. Now, without drifting into dramatic territory, it's safe to say her story became one of reputation weaponized. Her rise was dazzling. Her fall was swift. But even before events concluded, her name was entangled in gossip. And gossip in royal courts was a slow poison. It seeped into every corner. Honor was also tied to family lineage in more subtle ways. Take the sprawling web of the Habsburg dynasty. Their obsession with preserving dynastic purity was rooted in maintaining prestige. Keeping territories within the family. Keeping power concentrated. The result, over generations, was visible. Physical traits intensified. Health issues multiplied. Charles II of Spain became the most famous example. He carried the weight of generations of strategic marriages. His health was fragile. His reign was overshadowed by questions of succession. Yet his existence was the logical extension of an honor culture that prioritized lineage preservation above biological practicality. No one intended for things to become delicate. But they also refused to double down in a different direction. Because to admit error would be to admit weakness. And weakness bruised reputation. Let's drift briefly to Japan, where honor took a slightly different but equally intense form. In the samurai code of Bushido, personal honor was paramount. Public shame could lead to ritual suicide. Now, we won't linger there in detail. Just note that across cultures, reputation often outweighed comfort. Sometimes even outweighed survival. Back in Europe, commoners also lived within honor systems. Village reputation mattered deeply. If you were known as honest, hardworking, modest, you thrived socially. If you were labeled lazy or immoral, doors closed. Markets became colder. Neighbors less cooperative. Court records from medieval towns show frequent defamation cases. People sued each other for insults. Being called a thief or adulterer wasn't just mean. It was economically damaging. Reputation affected trade, marriage prospects, and social inclusion. Clergy were not immune either. Priests were expected to embody moral uprightness. When members of the Catholic Church failed publicly, the tension between ideal and reality created scandal. Reform movements often began with whispers about clerical behavior. Because spiritual authority rests heavily on perceived virtue. Honor, in every class, was about visibility. What others saw. What they believed. What they repeated. Let's gently imagine a medieval feast. Candles flickering. Nobles seated at long tables. Conversation carefully measured. Everyone aware of posture. Tone. Eye contact. A misplaced joke could linger longer than the roast. Public ceremonies reinforced honor hierarchies. Coronations. Marriages. Baptisms. Each event choreographed to display legitimacy. A crown placed just so. A vow spoken clearly. Because symbols mattered. And yet, beneath all the ritual, humans remained fragile. Kings worried about heirs. Queens worried about gossip. Knights worried about failing publicly. Merchants worried about slander. Honor culture created a society hyper-aware of perception. Every gesture could be interpreted. Every rumor carried weight. As we settle further into the quiet rhythm of this world, it becomes almost peaceful. Predictable, even. Everyone performing their roles. Guarding their reputations like delicate glass. It's exhausting, of course. But also strangely stable. When everyone knows the script, the play continues smoothly. And so tonight, as you drift closer to sleep, imagine that heavy but orderly world. A place where names carried history. Where family crests mattered. Where whispers could bruise more than swords. Honor and shame were invisible threads. Pulling gently on every life. Hey guys, tonight we begin softly. No roaring armies. No dramatic sieges. No thundering speeches from castle balconies. Just quiet resistance. The kind that happens behind closed doors. In whispered conversations. In letters folded twice and sealed with wax. So dim the lights. Let your breathing slow. Imagine a long stone corridor somewhere in medieval Europe, torchlight flickering gently against damp walls. Power lives here. But so does resentment. And tonight, we're drifting into the subtle art of rebellion that doesn't look like rebellion at all. Because not every act of defiance comes with a banner and a trumpet. Sometimes it's a refusal to smile at court. Sometimes it's a marriage arranged, slightly differently than expected. Sometimes it's a son who nods respectfully to his father, and then quietly does the opposite. Let's begin with royalty. Because of course we will. Kings loved the idea of obedience. They assumed it came bundled with birthright. But their children, spouses, and nobles often had other plans. And rather than storming the gates, they preferred something more delicate. A slow shift. A careful undermining. Take Henry II of England. He was efficient. Intelligent. Tireless. He built a powerful administrative state across England and large parts of France. He believed firmly in authority. His authority. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was equally formidable. She had ruled Aquitaine in her own right. She had divorced a king before Henry. Which already suggests she was not especially fond of quiet submission. Their marriage began as a powerful alliance. It slowly transformed into a partnership strained by pride and ambition. Eleanor's rebellion wasn't loud at first. It was strategic. She cultivated alliances among her sons. She supported their claims when they challenged Henry's authority. This was not a battlefield spectacle. It was family tension turned political. A domestic disagreement that rippled outward into dynastic instability. Henry was bewildered. Offended. Deeply frustrated. But the rebellion had already taken root inside his own household. Which is the most inconvenient place for dissent. Let's float gently over to another royal household that specialized in quiet resistance. The sprawling and complicated Habsburg dynasty. Their method of preserving power was simple. Marry internally. Consolidate land. Repeat. The strategy worked politically. Biologically, less so. Within this tightly woven family, subtle rebellions took the form of private frustrations. Younger sons who knew they would never inherit. Daughters married off to distant courts, carrying with them homesickness and resentment wrapped in silk. Not every protest was public. Sometimes it was emotional withdrawal. Or passive resistance in governance. Consider Maria Theresa. She inherited a fragile empire and faced skepticism simply because she was a woman. Her resistance was not flamboyant. It was administrative. Persistent. She reorganized systems. Strengthened state structures. Quietly proved her competence over decades. She did not need theatrics. She needed endurance. Now let's drift into France, where court life practically required subtle defiance. Under Louis XIV, Versailles became a theater of obedience. Nobles competed for the privilege of holding a candlestick. Or watching the king wake up. Which sounds exhausting. And it was designed to be. Louis centralized power so thoroughly that open rebellion became impractical. So nobles adapted. They formed quiet factions. They whispered alliances in hallways. They manipulated marriages. Resistance became social. A slight refusal to flatter. A strategic absence from a gathering. A carefully timed rumor. It was rebellion through etiquette. And sometimes the resistance came from unexpected places. Take Marie Antoinette. Before her story reached its more dramatic chapters, her early acts of subtle defiance were almost personal. She disliked rigid court protocol. She preferred informal gatherings at the Petit Trianon. She surrounded herself with a smaller circle of friends. This quiet retreat from Versailles etiquette irritated traditionalists. She wasn't storming the Bastille. She was simply opting out of exhausting ritual. But in a court built on performance, opting out felt rebellious. Now let's descend from royal marble halls to something softer. Villages. Towns. Everyday people. Peasant resistance rarely looked heroic. It was slower. More practical. Sometimes it meant underreporting harvest yields to avoid higher taxes. Sometimes it meant working just slowly enough to signal dissatisfaction. Sometimes it meant communal silence when authorities asked inconvenient questions. In parts of medieval France and England, villagers developed subtle ways to negotiate obligations. They might delay payments. Petition collectively. Or quietly support local leaders who challenged unfair policies. Resistance did not always shout. Often it sighed. Let's gently shift toward religious life. The authority of the Catholic Church was vast. Spiritual, moral, economic. Yet even within monasteries and parishes, quiet dissent flickered. Reform movements often began with individuals who believed the institution had drifted from its ideals. They didn't begin with bonfires. They began with letters. Sermons. Personal example. A monk choosing stricter discipline. A priest advocating simplicity. Resistance through lifestyle. And then, occasionally, the quiet accumulated. Consider Martin Luther. Before his ideas spread widely, his initial act was academic. Posting theological questions. It was meant as debate. It became something larger. But at its heart, it began as intellectual resistance to institutional practice. Now, let's float back into dynastic households. Because families remain the most fertile ground for quiet rebellion. Take Nicholas II. A man shaped by expectation. He believed deeply in autocracy. He also struggled with decisiveness. His wife, Alexandra Fyodorovna, carried intense personal anxieties and a fierce loyalty to tradition. Within their court, subtle opposition simmered long before larger events unfolded. Advisors disagreed quietly. Nobles grew impatient. Some resisted not with open revolt, but with withdrawal of enthusiasm. A lack of cooperation. A hesitation to fully support imperial decisions. Sometimes resistance is simply fatigue. And in other cases, it's emotional. Consider Charles I of England. His belief in divine right was unwavering. Admirable in confidence. Problematic in flexibility. When Parliament resisted his policies, the tension built slowly. At first, it was procedural. Financial disputes. Legal debates. But underneath was a quiet assertion: authority could be shared. Charles resisted compromise. Parliament resisted submission. The conflict escalated historically, but at its origin was something quiet. A refusal to concede philosophical ground. Resistance, at its most subtle, is often ideological. Even in tightly controlled courts, individuals carved out small spaces of autonomy. Noblewomen cultivated salons where political ideas could circulate gently. Courtiers used humor as a shield. Writers embedded critique within poetry. And servants. Let's not forget them. Palace servants saw everything. Heard everything. They navigated power structures carefully. Their resistance might simply be selective loyalty. Or discreet information sharing. As you sink deeper into this quiet landscape, notice how rebellion rarely begins with shouting. It begins with discomfort. With misalignment between authority and reality. With someone, somewhere, deciding not to fully comply. It might look like a queen choosing her own companions. A noble delaying an oath. A peasant adjusting a ledger. A monk refining doctrine. A parliament insisting on procedure. None of it cinematic. All of it consequential. Quiet rebellions are like cracks in marble. Hard to see at first. Easy to ignore. But persistent. So tonight, as the candlelight flickers lower in your imagination, consider how power and resistance dance gently together. Not always dramatically. Often politely. A raised eyebrow. A withheld signature. A carefully chosen absence. History remembers the loud revolutions. But it is built just as much from these quieter ones. And somewhere, in a castle corridor or a village field, someone is always, softly, deciding not to obey quite as completely as expected.